If you've ever played a COD Zombies map, then you'd know that randomness plays a huge factor throughout your entire game. RNG, which you might know stands for random number generation, is present throughout every map in Zombies history, and affects things such as power-ups, mystery box rolls and locations, part spawns, GobbleGum cycles, Easter egg steps, and much more. The implementation of RNG in Zombies helps maintain replayability, as no two matches will play the exact same as each other. This factors into why Easter egg speedruns are so unique for these games, as no two runs are alike, and you will always have different scenarios to account for. This is also why people have been able to run these maps for years, and why records continue to be beat over a decade later. There's a problem with how RNG works in Zombies though, a problem that took nearly a decade for players to discover. If you know how RNG works in any type of software, then you'd be aware that computers can't ever truly produce random outcomes on their own, but they usually get close enough. This should be the case for how COD Zombies handles its randomness, but there's a small issue. Call it a mistake, call it an oversight, call it lazy, or call it intentional, but this function in the game's code is flawed. Array_randomize is a function that gets called quite often through this game's scripts. To completely oversimplify how this works, this function's task is to take a list of things, known as an array, and randomizes its entries, better known as indexes. Some examples of indexes and arrays can range from what perks to choose from a free perk bottle, what weapons to choose from the mystery box, or what GobbleGum to choose from your gum cycle. The function reads these arrays and then tries to output a random result when called. This is what this function should look like when in action. Pick up a free perk bottle with no perks being acquired beforehand. This runs the perk bottle function. The perk bottle function calls array randomize using array perks. Then the function chooses a random index from the array and gives you a random perk. In practice, this is usually how this process works, and for casual or even hardcore players this will never be a problem. But speedrunners noticed a flaw in how this function chooses a random item from the list. Speedrunners go through hundreds to thousands to hundred thousands of attempts on maps to achieve records, and as human beings, we tend to notice patterns that occur through repetition. Many runners, myself included, were beginning to think to themselves that they were noticing that certain outcomes would happen more often than others. Certain weapons from the box would show up more than others, certain perks were obtained from raindrops more often, and certain gobblegums would show up frequently. But many runners just chalked it up to what we call copium, or confirmation bias. A few runners were noticing the same trends, but instead of writing it off, they decided to look deeper into it to see if there was any funny business at play. In August of 2025, BO3 runners Sackittome and Jeoy brought this up to other runners, but like usual the idea was shot down. However, they were adamant that something wasn't right with the code.
And we thought that was a known thing that everybody knew about. But I brought it up during a stream, and people said, no, it's random. I was like, okay, let's just, show me the code. Ross showed the code, and it said, random perk. So he's like, so yeah, it's obviously random. And then that's when we started thinking, well, maybe it's not, truly random. Maybe they, messed it up. Because I was, fully confident at that point that, the perks from raindrops were not correct. Or, even. And that's when Aesthetic ran the simulations. And then everything started to get found out from there.
After some discussion, these runners decided to really look into how things worked. They looked over the free perk bottle code, but everything seemed to be in order. Then, the function array_randomize was looked over, and this is where the discovery was made. To put it simply, the way the function shuffles indexes in the list that it chooses actually manages to put weighting on certain outcomes. We'll explore this more in depth later. Once Sack and another player, Aesthetic, noticed this, runners decided to run some simulations, and the results were vindicating. These screenshots show that after millions of simulated random perk drops, the game was choosing certain perks to give to the player over others. So here's what's going on with this function when it runs. Like stated before, the function takes a given array and either shuffles the indexes or chooses a random index from the array. When it chooses a random outcome, it actually puts weighting on indexes that show up earlier in the array, except for the very first index, which remains mostly random. The indexes are also numbered starting at 0. For example, the array that the perks were written in on Buried goes as follows. Jug, which is index 0 and first in the array, remains mostly random. Double Tap is index 1, which has the most weighting. Mule Kick is index 2, which has the second most weighting. Quick Revive is third, has the third most weighting, Stam is fourth, Vulture Rage's fifth, and Speed Cool is sixth, making it the least common perk to get from a free perk bottle. Aesthetic goes into what could be causing this flaw in the function on this GitHub page. If you'd like a more in-depth explanation as to why this might be occurring, then you can pause to read this. I'll also put a link to the page in the description. So now that it's understood how this works, what can we do to exploit it? Well, let's start going through instances where this function's used. What about the mystery box and random perks? Well, kinda. We can't change the array, but if we figure out what index 1 is in the array, then we can try and take that item out of the array and leave room for the less common occurrences. What about part spawns, drop cycles, or Easter egg steps? Well, unfortunately, there's nothing we can do to make good outcomes more common. The arrays for these systems in the game were already written by whoever worked on the map, and as far as we know, there's nothing that the player can do to arbitrarily change these arrays through gameplay alone. If only there were a feature in a game that let us choose the order of the indexes in an array so that we can manipulate the odds of getting something that we wanted. It turns out that the GobbleGum machine also uses array randomize to choose a random gum from your cycle every time you use it. The important part is that the array that the GobbleGum machine calls is based on your GobbleGum pack. This means that instead of being preset in the game's code, the GobbleGum array can actually be changed to give you an advantage. So let's say we want a specific GobbleGum at the beginning of a match. Can we change the array in a way that benefits us? We can. Most maps in BO3 play for raindrops from the first hit of your gum cycle. So if you put raindrops in the second spot in the gum cycle, then that means it'll be the most common gum on the very first hit of your game. This gets really complicated when dealing with multiple gum cycles throughout the course of a run, so people have created images to help visualize how this works. Through this knowledge, speedrunners have developed optimal gum packs for every single map in the game. It should be known, however, that for the majority of people, nothing really changes. The percentages are so small that differences are only noticed over extremely long periods of time. You won't notice something like this over the course of a few games, but it can be slightly useful for world record attempts that require thousands of resets. Being able to manipulate your gum pack to get the right gums in the right spots of your cycle is already insane on its own, but there is one more application of this knowledge that can be used in speedruns. Earlier I said that you couldn't use this for Easter egg steps, but that isn't entirely true. There are actually 2 Easter egg steps where this knowledge could be useful for a speedrun. Die Rise and Buried both have steps at the end of their Easter eggs that require you to input a code that you find by searching around the map or through trial and error. Now, because speedrunners are trying to beat these Easter eggs as fast as possible, the optimal route requires you to guess these codes from complete scratch. But, since these steps also use the flawed function, we can do some testing to find out which codes the map generates the most. The function creates these random codes in a similar way to how it randomizes everything else, but rather than giving individual indexes weighting, the entire combinations are given weighting instead. The simulations will then show us the most common codes that the game produces. BO2 scripter Hadi ended up running these tests himself, and he made these spreadsheets showing the results. For Buried, the most common order of switches ends up being green, blue, yellow, red. For Die Rise, the most common tower code ends up being south, north, west, east. This will never guarantee success for either of these steps, but since they're the most common orders that the game generates, it could be worth inputting them for a slightly higher chance of success on your first try. This is one of the most interesting discoveries that speedrunners have ever made over the course of this franchise's history, and it makes us wonder what else could be hiding out there. Even the smallest discoveries can breathe so much life into the community and bring everyone together to investigate and share their findings. These games are all made through an incredibly short development cycle, so there are definitely more features in these games that might not work as the developers first intended. There may even be more to find with Array Randomize, as it sees use throughout many COD games, from the very first COD game released in 2003, all the way up to Cold War released in 2020. Nowadays, the modern games use a proper implementation of this function, so this issue shouldn't exist anymore, but as we know, there could be more secrets to find by digging into the code. It's possible that the next massive speedrun skip or time save is staring us right in our faces, so it's absolutely worth it to scour every line of code and test any theories you might have. So, is there anything you think I missed involving this function? If so, let me know in the comments. There are way more niche tricks and topics that I'd love to cover soon, so stay tuned for more in the future. And as always, thank you for watching.